In this week's video, I'm going to be trimming the stoneware jar, which I demonstrated the throwing of in my previous upload, and I'll leave a link to that video down in the description below. I begin by reattaching this pot to the wheel by brushing some slip over the base of the pot. It's then placed onto the metal wheel head and tab centered, and with each slap, as the pot is knocked into center, it creates friction, which causes the slip to dry quickly and stick really quite firmly to the metal, as long as you do it right, at least. And perhaps sometime in the future, I'll make a video specifically about that technique, as it isn't so widely used, and it really has come to be one of the most important aspects of my trimming process. I begin turning the outside of this pot with very sharp turning tools, and initially I'm just turning away the slight irregularity that you can see in the wavering rim and the section of the lip just beneath it. Inevitably, as pots dry, they move. The walls of these pots are pulled up in spiralling motions during the throwing stage, and as that wet clay slowly becomes leather hard, those spirals in the walls, even if completely flattened out like this, will unwind slightly. That alone can cause a slight undulation to happen, yet they're also encouraged if the pot is dried out too quickly or too unevenly. It's impossible to get it 100% right, especially when you're creating shapes that have quite dramatic angles in them. In an ideal world, I'd let all my pots dry out very slowly beneath plastic. That way the thrown forms can remain perfect, potentially. Yet, that would increase the time it takes to create pots exponentially, as ultimately I want the pots that I make to dry out within a day or two before I turn them, instead of taking a week or more, as that would considerably slow down the rate at which I can make work. If you look carefully, you may have just seen that the surface of the pot I was trimming was quite textured. We call this chattering, and it tends to occur with certain tools when you're trimming clay that's perhaps slightly too firm, or with the tool held at a very specific angle. And perhaps the only downside of using these incredibly sharp tungsten carbide turning tools is that they tend to be prone to chattering when used on clay that's slightly firm and grogged. Grogged in this case meaning textured. And so once a specific area has been trimmed with the tungsten carbide turning tool, like this, for instance, which I'm just skimming over the surface to create as flat a plane as possible, I'll then go over this trimmed surface with this straight, flat edge of a metal kidney, which is held really firmly against the surface, and it scrapes away all the unwanted maker's marks left, as well as the more distinctive chattering marks, if there are any. It's really rare that I use a tool like this, held with two hands to keep it steady, but in this case, as I feel like the pot is really stuck firmly in place, I feel safe doing it. And I say safe because typically, when I do this, I'll hold the tool with my right hand only, as my left hand is elsewhere on the pot, ready to catch it at a moment's notice if it does come loose, which is always a possibility when you're trimming pots, no matter the technique you've used to pin it down. With the top section of the pot trimmed, it's time to move on to the lower half, and initially I'm going to be holding my turning tool as steadily as possible and slowly move it down the surface of the pot, so that for the first few passes it only removes clay from the highest revolving point, as doing so removes the slight waver in this section of the wall, and it gets it to the point where it spins completely true. If I attempted to do this with the tool clasped loosely in my hand, then any slight wobble, undulation or waver in the wall is generally just exacerbated as your tool follows them, and you can actually go from having a pot that has a very slight irregularity in the wall to one that's really very severe if you let it go unchecked. And so what this means is that you need to get rid of it as quickly as you can, and typically for this task, on the lower section of these pots, I use this hook-shaped turning tool, which is another Philpo Berker or Bison turning tool. It's incredible for just digging into the wall, although as they are so sharp it's really easy to get carried away, removing more clay than I would have liked. But, as my pots are mostly straight-sided forms, or they're made up of many straight planes, it helps having a turning tool that is really straight, as I can use it as a guide almost as I'm working, and as long as the surface of the pot matches the straight side of the blade, then I know I'm trimming that section straight. Additionally, to help keep my arm steady, I brace it on the plastic wheel tray, and sometimes, as I'm working further up on the pot, I'll brace part of my right hand on my left hand that travels up with it. And if there's nothing there to support it, I simply make sure that I'm holding the tool incredibly tightly, with my index finger pushing firmly near the very tip of the wooden handle. I may remove a bit more from the bottom once the pot's flipped over, as by handling the pot off the wheel, I'll gain an understanding of how much weight is left. It may need a little more removed, but in case it doesn't, I'll skim over the surface now and leave it nice and neat, whilst the pot is still attached nice and firmly to the wheel. In many ways, I suppose the most crucial aspect of this particular shape is the very sharp line that encircles the waist, as it's this ledge, ultimately, that'll interact the most with the glaze that's coated over the pot. Next, I can move on to the rim, and there isn't a lot to do here, other than trimming the lip to come to a finer point and just smoothing out the walls inside the rim slightly, just as I don't particularly want any throwing rings near the opening of the vessel. The rim of this piece is another very important part too, as it's often through the rim of a pot that you perceive the overall weight of a piece. If I left the rim thick and heavy and squared off, then you may perceive the entire pot to be as thick and heavy as the rim, whereas if it's trimmed to a much finer point, then you'll perceive the pot as being more delicate and fine, and these are of course the perceptions you make before you even pick the pot up. To smooth over the throwing rings on the inside somewhat, I just push the edge of a firm rubber kidney against them. It won't get rid of them entirely, but it will just soften them somewhat. And then as this trimming tool does have such a fine tip, it's very useful for trimming in the more distinct lines where the angles change. To remove a pot stuck like this, I carefully slide a sharp metal edge beneath it and hopefully catch the pot before it teeters off to one side. The wheel head is then scraped clean. This way, when I place the delicate rim of the pot upside down onto the metal, no burrs of clay stick themselves into the relatively soft clay of the rim, which would be a pain considering how carefully I just finished it. I try to place it down as centrally as I can, as I don't particularly want to knock it around too much, as that could also damage the carefully finished rim. Then, I use 3 lugs of really soft clay, and I push them carefully around the rim of the pot. When I do this, I'm actually pushing it down against the metal head, rather than pushing it horizontally into the pot itself, as by forcing the clay against the pot that is still actually relatively quite soft, you may accidentally distort the rim. I then place a trusty spinner on top, through which I can apply downward pressure just to help keep the pot pinned down in place, and then the trimming can commence again. And I felt like this piece was still just a tiny bit bottom heavy, so I'll just do a few more careful passes on this section to lighten the pot and to also make it more narrow, which I think will make the pot appear more elegant. I could just use my fingertips to push down on the pot from above, but by using this spinner tool it distributes the downward pressure out, so it isn't all focused in one spot, which, if I was trimming a pot that had a particularly thin base, may prevent it from bowing inward. In the long term, say if I'm having a trimming day, where I have a few hundred pieces to get through, it prevents the skin of my fingertips from being ground away slightly, as this stoneware clay body does contain a small amount of grog. You might not notice it at first, but after a long day of work, using your fingertips to push the pot down in place, you'll be surprised by just how red and raw they can become. Anyway, at this point, using these tools has just become second nature. I check the base by pushing it firmly with a finger just to see if there's any movement, as if by pressing it I did immediately cause the base to bow inward, then I'd know that I couldn't trim any more away from it. So, after every few passes when turning the base, I'll gently press in the very middle with my thumb or finger just to make sure I haven't removed too much. I want it to probably be about 3 or 4 millimeters thick. You could potentially go thinner, but I'll be pouring quite a lot of glaze inside this piece, and if the layer of glaze inside is thicker than the actual clay on the bottom, then there's a really high chance that the base could crack, especially with a bigger piece too. Yet, the exact same thing can happen if you leave the base too thick, especially if it's much thicker than the walls of clay above it, and this is commonly when something called an S-crack occurs, as the different thicknesses of the pot dry out at different rates, and even when they're firing, they'll heat up at different rates and cool down at different rates, whereas really we want everything to happen as evenly as possible. Once I'm happy with the bottom, I'll burnish smooth the trimmed section before moving on to beveling the bottom edge. This creates a base that's less likely to chip, especially as I'm using a high iron clay that's reduction fired, as they're slightly more susceptible to chipping and being damaged. And this just makes the contact angle slightly less severe, whilst at the same time it'll cause the pot to cast a very slight shadow underneath it, making it appear almost as if it's floating, as if it's weightless. At last, I take my maker's mark, which I carved myself from a block of porcelain, and reduction fired it alongside the rest of my pots. I use porcelain as it's really durable. It also shrinks a tremendous amount throughout the process. This means that once it's been fired, I end up with a much finer maker's mark, as it's all sort of condensed, and that's exactly how I want my maker's mark to be. I don't want it to be obviously visible, or branded on the side of a pot. Rather, it's this little hidden indentation underneath it. It's pushed into the stoneware and rocked from corner to corner so it leaves a legible impression. Now, the last thing I do is quickly dry out the base somewhat. This is done as if I were to take this pot off and place it directly on my wearboard. When the clay is still slightly soft, the grain of the wood could embed itself into the stoneware, so it's dried and placed onto a very clean patch on the wearboard. And here's the finished pot next to its smaller counterpart, which doesn't look that small anymore, a sign that I probably need to scale up this version even more. But at least the shape is good. I think the proportions are right, and I think the slightly wider waist works quite well, but this piece is still going to shrink quite a lot between now and when it's fired, as more and more of the moisture evaporates. So, you may see me throwing an even bigger one of these very soon. Anyhow, that's all for this week. Thank you, as always, for watching, and I'll see you next time.